Crafty Gemini. I post weekly videos right here on my YouTube channel, and in this video tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to make the peak block using my 10-inch slicer. Now to make the peak block, we're going to start off with 2 square pieces of fabric that measure 10 inches by 10 inches. Whether they're pre-cut or you cut down the yardage yourself into the 10-inch by 10-inch squares, either way will work just fine. And then you're going to use my 10-inch slicer ruler. So I'm going to show you how to do this. Now, one thing that I like to say is that this is a great project for a beginner into quilting, because although it has a triangle, it's not cut or pieced like a traditional triangle and patchwork that you would be cutting out yourself. Because you know, when you're cutting edges and points and things with angles in them in patchwork, you have to make sure that you cut very accurately and that you sew accurately. Otherwise, you're going to run the risk of cutting off the point at the peak of that triangle. You don't have to worry about any of that when you're piecing together this block with my 10-inch slicer, because you're going to be using my ruler as a template to cut perfectly, and as long as you can sew a straight line, you'll be able to put these blocks together. First, let's have a look at these 2 blocks. These are the same block. I call them the peak block. And this little guy was made with my 5-inch slicer, and it's made using 2 square pieces of fabric that measure 5 inches by 5 inches. From 2 squares of contrasting fabrics, you will end up with 2 peak blocks. You're just going to swap out the pieces. So with the leftovers that I had from here, from the ones that I used to this one, you can see how this one would go pieced together. Okay, so there's no waste. There's minimal trimming that you do kind of just to clean up the edges, but from 2 5-inch squares, you end up with 2 blocks like this. So I already have a step-by-step video tutorial on how to do this block with 5-inch squares using my 5-inch slicer. If you're interested in that, I'll link to it here at the lowercase letter I that you see on the top right-hand corner of the video player. I'll also put a link in the description box below for you on where you can get the 5-inch slicer so you can make these blocks if you like the little ones. Now, in this video tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make the same peak block but using the big guy, the 10-inch slicer. And this one is designed to be used with 2 square pieces of fabric that measure 10 inches by 10 inches. So I'm going to be working with these 2 colors, and I want you to show you the 2 blocks that I made from 2 square pieces of the same fabric. So if we have a look, these are the 2 blocks that I got. I had 1 square of this fabric and 1 square of this fabric. And when I cut them up to create this block, and I'm going to show you how to orient the ruler and make your cuts, you swap out the center triangles so you get 2 coordinating blocks. So a great way to use up those 10-inch pre-cut squares you may have, and also a great fun and easy way to whip up a quick quilt because these blocks are a good size. We'll be working with the 10-inch slicer, which is a ruler that I designed and I have manufactured here in the United States. And I designed this ruler to help you create a variety of different quilt blocks using only 10-inch by 10-inch square pieces of fabric with virtually no waste. So we're going to start off with these 2 squares, and we're going to cut them one by one. For those of you that are not familiar with my ruler, I'll include a link here for you on where you can get it and more information, as well as the page where you have a free video library of all the different ways that I've done video tutorials on how to make different blocks with the ruler. So the way this is going to work is I have pressed here a 10-inch by 10-inch square piece of fabric. And I'm going to place my ruler so that the narrow end of it is closest to my body. You notice the wide edge is up top. And then I'm going to slide it over so that the edge of the fabric is on the 1 1/4 inch line. 1 1/4 inch line. Make sure that you have that line going all the way up your fabric. And then the top edge of the ruler should also be flush here with your fabric. Then we put some pressure on the ruler and we're going to make our first cut. Follow this asymmetrical edge of my 10-inch slicer. All right, so that's what you have. Now we need to make the same cut, but on the opposite side, mirror imaged. And again, this raw edge needs to be placed on the 1 1/4 inch line. So if you notice, from here to the solid line is 1, and I'm placing the raw edge of the fabric on the 1 1/4. So that is key. Make sure I have it going all the way up the edge of my block. And now this can be a little tricky because I'm right-handed, so you don't really want to do this and crisscross your hands when you're working with a rotary cutter. So instead, I recommend either a rotating cutting mat, which can come in handy, or if you're using a smaller mat, all you got to do is spin the mat 180 degrees. Now the ruler's on my left, and I can easily, with my right hand, cut right there. So these are the 3 cuts, or excuse me, the 3 pieces that you end up getting from the 2 cuts that we made. We're going to do the exact same thing to this block, and then we'll just swap out the center triangle. So let's move this over. To cut a fresh new block, remember that we need to line up the edge of the fabric on the 1 1/4 inch line of the 10-inch slicer. Now here's a tip, and something that I came across recently are these little glow line tapes. They come like this. This one came with a pack of 3 colors, and it's basically transparent fluorescent tape that you can use to highlight lines or shapes on your ruler. So this will help you if you find that you have a hard time keeping the same line lined up. If you make a few off cuts, then you know you need to mark that line with something that's going to make it a little bit easier for you to see. So you can see how the tape is kind of see-through, so it's not fully opaque. It will still allow you to see through the ruler or the lines depending on where you put it. And so it doesn't really matter where you place this, on what side of the ruler, since we use the ruler on both sides to get symmetrical cuts. So I've placed it to the left. I'm looking at the ruler the way that it's oriented correctly this way, and I've placed this to the left of that 1 1/4 inch line, okay? So now when I flip this over, I'm going to line up the edge of my tape right on the edge of my fabric here. And now I know that this is oriented correctly. Do you see how that goes 1 inch and then 1 1/4? So flush at the bottom, at the top, and I'm going to put some pressure here and cut. And I'm just going to pick up my little mat, since I don't have my rotating one here with me, and make the same cut on the other side. Make sure that it's the mirror imaged cut, okay? So if this was cut like this, the next cut needs to be like this. And again, I can measure right there with my tape and place my fabric edge on the 1 1/4 inch line that I've marked off. You can also use painter's tape or just anything, a little label, something to mark that line if you find that you have trouble just remembering it in your head. All right, so we have our 3 pieces from both of our different fabrics. And see, if I swap out the triangle here, I would just piece these back together and I would have one finished block done. Now with solid fabrics, it's easier to cut because there's really no right or wrong side to this fabric. When you're using print fabrics, in order to get everything the way that you want it to, make sure that you start off cutting your blocks with the pretty side of the fabric facing up. Now to sew these blocks up, I find it helpful to orient the blocks pretty side of the fabrics face up the way that it's going to look once the block is sewn together. Then I just flip one on top of the other with pretty sides of each fabric touching each other, so you know that you have it oriented correctly, because this can get a little tricky, and if you're a beginner, especially if you haven't made that many quilt blocks, you can get mixed up and sew them in a different orientation. Now, I typically will use a glue basting technique where I put little dots of glue in where the seam allowance is, and then I press it with an iron. Today, I am just going to put a couple of pins here and head over to the sewing machine and sew these up. Now, we're going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and if you notice, because we're kind of offset here at a weird angle, you still want to come in a 1/4 inch over from that edge. Then you stitch straight, and you're just going to come all the way off the fabric pieces, okay? Don't worry about having these weird angles, because when we flip it back, it's going to be perfectly right. So I'll take this and I'll bring this so I can sew this one to it at the sewing machine as well. Now I'll finger crease this back so that while I'm here, I can just go ahead and sew the other side. Okay? Again, orient it the way it's supposed to look when it's done, and then flip them pretty sides touching. Now we can head over to the ironing board here, press this seam flat, and I always, on these blocks, I like to press the seams to the outside. So this way into whatever fabric is on the sides. One finished peak block. You can see that we have a little bit off here and a little dog ear up there that needs to be trimmed. So that's really all the waste that you'll end up with after you trim that up. Now, one thing that I like about my 10-inch slicer is that I also use a 10-inch slicer to trim up my blocks. So right here, I'm going to place it up top and just get rid of that little dog ear. And then we'll turn it over here and make it so everything is nice and flush on this bottom edge. And there's the finished block. You can see that these little bits is all the waste I ended up with from those two 10-inch squares. Now you'll notice that the block is slightly rectangular in shape. So I get this question a lot when people ask if the block still finishes 10 by 10. There's no way for it to still measure 10 inches because we've cut into it and sewn up seam allowances, making the fabric dimensions shorter, both on the sides and vertically as well. So if you measure it, and yours may be slightly different than mine, I tend to sew with really narrow 1/4-inch seams, so my block will probably be a little bigger than yours. It ends up being about 9 1/4 across this way and 9 3/4 tall. So just because the block is not exactly a square does not mean that you have to trim it down. If you want the block to be a perfect square, you can do that. But for me, there's no sense in wasting fabric just because you have a slightly rectangular shape in a block. The key thing is that the blocks match, right, when you go to sew them all together. So if you repeat the same steps to an entire stack of blocks, all you're going to do is end up with identical blocks. So when you sew them up together, you won't have a problem making the rows and the columns, okay? So don't feel like you have to go in and trim these down to like 9 inches square because you're going to be wasting a ton of fabric. Just leave them as the rectangular shape that they are, trim them up like we just did, and make sure that all of your blocks measure the same size, whatever the dimension is there, you know, with the minimal amount of waste, okay? And that's how you make the peak block using 2 square pieces of 10-inch by 10-inch squares of fabric and my Crafty Gemini 10-inch slicer. All right, and that is it. I hope you enjoyed learning how to make my peak block using the 10-inch slicer. If you don't yet have one of these rulers, I'll include a link below, also link to it here, where you can go into my online shop and purchase these from us. Now remember that when you buy my rulers, you don't have to buy any separate patterns. Instead, I provide you with a free video library of all the different blocks that you can make using my 10-inch slicer ruler. So this peak block is just another one added to it. If you don't have the little guy, this one is designed for the 10-inch pre-cut squares. I also have a 5-inch slicer designed for 5-inch squares, the little charm packs that you find. And you can see that I actually already have a video tutorial on how to make the little peak block using the 5-inch slicer. So now you'll be able to make both of these. And I think this would look great in a quilt, coordinated, right? Some like this, maybe some negative space. That would make for a really cute, bright, funky, and modern quilt. So I hope that you enjoyed this video tutorial on how to use my 10-inch slicer ruler to create the peak block. If you enjoyed it, hit it with the thumbs up below, share it with your crafty and quilty friends, and if you like what you see, go ahead and click that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of my future videos. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.